welcome to Mastermind Roundtable. Today it's me and Duncan again. Today we are going to talk about ESG investments.
Sure, Morris. Looking forward to it.
Yes, normally people would think that before ESG investments, you will earn pretty handsome returns from your equities, from your global portfolios. But now you have to reshuffle your portfolio holdings, basically match or to echo with your ESG advocates, policies. So what do you think about how, sustainable investing balance the financial returns?
I think it's balancing the risk and rewards because, as you say, as an investor, and insurance companies typically are long-term investors, you want to be able to own those sustainable returns, whether you hold the debt or the equity. It's about taking a balanced, risk-based approach so that we assess those risks for those companies, and we want those companies to have resilient business models so that they can generate those returns. So ultimately for us, we want them to be able to repay their debt or pay the interest on their debt, or we want their business to keep growing in a sustainable way, and we don't take necessary judgment calls in terms of excluding particular sectors.
Really?
Because we're not a moral-based investor, so we wouldn't, for example, exclude alcohol-based or gambling-based securities or bonds. What we do is all risk-based. If we've excluded certain assets or certain sectors, for example, coal, it's because we've taken a view that they present stranded assets in the long run. And if we're still holding those assets on our balance sheet, then we could be facing impairment or losses. And as a long-term investor, we do not want to be in that position.
Which makes sense. Many people believe there might be certain regulations or internal policies to prohibit related bonds or securities, carbon-consuming intensive industries. So it seems it is still based on the risk-based approach to manage the portfolios, right? In general, would it be like after I adopt the ESG investment policies or approach, my financial return actually become worse?
I think the jury is still out, to be fair. There is a mixture of sources out in the market and studies. Some show strong returns and others show varying returns on such kind of portfolio. So it really does depend. But it also, I think, in terms of ensuring what you want to do as a company from your commitments and your ambitions is also, the financial returns obviously is important because for us as a long-term investor, we need to be able to generate those returns from our assets to meet our long-term liabilities. But when you marry that with the corporate commitments such as net zero and decarbonization, then you need to then also pivot your portfolios in a way that meets those. And so that's where the data and the taxonomies and the analysis comes in.
Yeah, which makes sense, especially that your company is a listed company. When balancing the financial returns in the meantime, you would also need to consider, because after all, ESG consists of three components. Not just financial returns, but also care about whether you are environmentally friendly, whether you are socially responsible, and whether you have very strong internal governance, right, as well.
Yes, and I think irrespective of the corporate attitudes, the regulators will increasingly ask certainly listed companies to disclose more. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange is a good example of that. And they have certain listing requirements that all the listed companies would need to comply with. So that has a bearing as well. But of course, for us, net zero, the corporate commitment towards decarbonization is something that we've voluntarily done because we believe it is good. It's the right thing for us and our purpose, but it's also the right thing for the communities that we operate and support. And we operate in 18 markets around Asia.
I think you mentioned one very important keyword, purpose. That's the keyword driving so many corporations, I think, in their policies and decision makings. Are there particular metrics that you will use to evaluate the effectiveness of your ESG investing strategies?
Right. So we've integrated ESG principles on the investment side into our investment processes, such as assessment of ESG characteristics of the companies that our research analysts cover and our portfolio managers take decisions on. We integrate principles of stewardship, so engagement with our investee companies, exercising voting, and then also in terms of good corporate disclosures, including our climate
Right.
disclosures, which we make once a year in our ESG report.
Right.
In terms of that, the metrics, I would say you should have ambitions to meet recognized international standards and frameworks. So for us, we are a member of the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures,
Right.
and we also disclose in accordance with TCFD's recommendations, such as measuring the weighted average carbon intensity of our equity portfolio and also our financed emissions. So these are the scope 3, category 15 emissions from our in-scope investments within the
Right.
fixed income, equities, and direct real estate space
Right.
as well.
Do you actually also need to adhere to regulations in EU or in North America?
We have certain funds that are based and domiciled in Luxembourg, so we do need to comply with the CSSF regulations and the EU regulations as well. So we have Article 6, Article 8, Article 9 funds.
Right.
But those are disclosures in relation to those specific funds. As a company, it is our ambitions, it's the regulators that we have, so the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and also our corporate ambitions,
Right.
together with the various frameworks and associations that we are members of. So you can see our credentials in our ESG report. We're supporters of the Paris Agreement, members of the UNPRI, Principles for Responsible Investment as an asset owner, TCFD supporter. We follow those recommendations in terms of the disclosures. And then the way we calculate our scope 3 category 15 financed emissions is in relation to industry standard best practice. So we use the PCAF methodology, stands for the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. So we apply that methodology in terms of our investments and the emissions data, and then we also use an external vendor to help us make those calculations.
So it sounds there's actually a very holistic and comprehensive set of metrics in place. So with these metrics in place, what are the challenges, such as, inconsistent data across different countries and different places, and greenwashing, as we have heard so often in this topic, right? So what do you...
Sure. Inconsistent data, or sometimes not every company will disclose the information that you want. The beauty of using an industry standard framework like PCAF is that it has a waterfall of permissible metrics and sources. Obviously, for example, the company's own disclosures, what they disclose as their emissions, will be the first source. And then you can also use proxies such as sector peers or industry peers or geographical locations as well. So the PCAF methodology does have that kind of waterfall. So you should aim for the best and then work your way down if it's not around. And that helps to bolster the credibility.
Right.
And it also doesn't mean that you're not then just making things up. So the disclosure has its benefits in terms of robust disclosure.
Right.
Sometimes you don't disclose, that could be greenwashing or green hushing. Sometimes you disclose, but it might not be as rosy as whoever is making the disclosure makes it out to be. And that's when, for our companies, in terms of the research analysts that cover them, they won't necessarily verify those types of disclosures. But then because they are already looking at those companies, because we've integrated ESG into the investment process, they're already looking at the fundamentals of those companies and making either calls on the equity valuation of those companies, in their analysts' views, the creditworthiness is of those companies, then they will incorporate those into their views as well. So they're best placed out of all the people within the investment function to make the judgment in terms of how credible those disclosures are or not.
Right. So Duncan, you mentioned about integrating ESG into your company's existing processes.
Yep.
I know ESG integration is actually a big function within so many corporations. So can you share more details on how does this team works and what's their key functions or responsibilities?
So thanks. I mentioned at the start that we integrate ESG principles top down, but we also have bottom up processes as well. The bottom up processes are where the research analysts come in. We have research analysts both from the fixed income side and on the equity side. They will score those companies from an ESG perspective, we have our own methodology based on best-in-class asset managers and ESG rating agency methodology. And the analysts will score those companies across the E, S, and G pillars, but also against specific themes, weighted themes, specific to those particular sectors as well. And then so for example, climate change is a big theme across the E.
Right.
In terms of, do they have a net zero ambition targets? Do they publish emissions data? These will all be computed in and then come to an aggregate score that then gets mapped to, as we've put in the external disclosure, a 5-letter grade from A to E, A being the strongest and E being the lowest.
Right. Based on what you just said, Duncan, so ESG integration is definitely a new profession, which requires very specialized skill sets. And normally, because I got my CFAs and then I got it several years ago, but I'm pretty sure that the knowledge that we learned from our old CFA schemes is not going to be enough to cover this kind of special skill sets required in today's ESG environments.
I would say the beauty of ESG is that it's a broad, diverse discipline spanning across many. You have and everyone can play a different role in it. We've been talking about the ESG, the analysts, the research analysts who do the fundamental analysis, incorporate the ESG assessment into their analysis.
Right.
But then, say me and my team, we do the actual direction setting in terms of where do we want to take this investment program forward. What's the vision? What are the things that we want to be committing in, or when we've committed, how are we going to operationalize that? A lot of it is also change management as well. So change management brings its own challenges and opportunities. It's an opportunity to move the program forward, but then you're taking people out of their established comfort zones. They may be used to be doing things a certain way, seeing certain types of reports, thinking about things in a certain way. You can also influence and alignment. There's a lot of that. So ESG is hugely about communications. Both, we mentioned the ESG report, which is external communications and disclosure, but a lot of it's internal as well. You need to persuade those people. It's also a matter of battling for the hearts and minds for those people as well. So, and that's not just, it's not just the people within investment, it's also people outside investment. Why should we care about what you're doing in investment?
Yes, exactly. And I think one of the challenges is that it seems everything is written in the book, written on the paper.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, ESG investment actually involves so many communications because different interpretations, right? Different perspectives.
Yeah.
Right. It also involves a lot of alignments.
And everyone has different perspectives and priorities as well. It's almost like it's a big project where certain people care about certain things and others focus on different things, and it's finding that common ground enough to do it that we can measure it, disclose it in a robust way, and it can stand up to challenge, because otherwise we will face those accusations of greenwashing. And I think the other thing to point out is that no matter what you disclose, some people will be encouraged by it and give you positive feedback. There will always be others, and hopefully this is a smaller set, that will always say you're not doing enough. You should be doing more. And you can't win all the battles. You need to pick and choose the battles that you fight. Plus, change at large organizations doesn't necessarily occur overnight. It takes time to implement new technologies, processes, people's roles and responsibilities changing. They all need to be done in a conscientious way through time. And it can also be a multi-stage journey as well. If you try and jump to the end in one go, you'll find when you get there that there are other things that either make it obsolete, or things have moved on, or there are new things to think about. So it's constantly changing.
Exactly. So I think that's the challenge, because, say for example, AIA is always a leader in the industry. But in terms of ESG investments or the broader ESG space, I mean, if you are actually going too fast, which is somehow also dangerous, right? Because so many people, including regulators, they are watching you, right? Whether you are doing the right thing or whether you are leading people to the wrong direction. So I guess that's one of the challenges as well.
Yeah, and it certainly is. And I think the winds of change have been particularly strong in the last 6 months or 9 months, right? So it would have been tempting to put out a hugely ambitious agenda and then either realizing that you may not be able to meet everything that you try and set yourself to do, or that the geopolitical external circumstances that are beyond your control mean that it's harder. For example, if companies are stepping back from their disclosure because of the macro environment, or they're concentrating their resources on maintaining their business models and then diverting resources away from the ESG practitioners or disclosure, then you'll find that as an investor in those, they will affect you downstream as well. So we do things in a measured way and we always want to make sure that any kind of ambitions and targets we set ourselves are feasible. So by the time they are announced, you can be sure that the feasibility analysis has been done beforehand, and we are more than reasonably confident of being able to meet those.
Understand. So basically, you need to have a very sophisticated plan, but you have to plan your every single step very carefully.
You can plan the steps, yes, but it's not like you have this, here is the 5,800 step guide before we're able to make it. Within the company and within the department, you need to have a base level of items and objectives and metrics that will get you comfortable that you're on track to either meet the targets or have a high degree of confidence that you'll be able to meet it. Obviously you can't adjust for things that are unforeseen.
Right.
You just need to react and pivot or plan accordingly while staying true to your commitments and targets. And that's exactly what we're doing. We've got the targets, 3 on the investment side, 1 due at the end of this year, and then 2 due at the end of 2030, and we're staying true to those. But we also know that under the methodology that we've signed up to, we need to refresh those targets by 2028 at the latest. So we will then also, from now to 2028, we will also be looking at what's come into scope from the mandatory perspective on the methodology, look at the extra data that we need, what are the challenges, and then we'll also have to go through the feasibility analysis. How hard is it to get there if we were to make a target of this, bring in these extra asset class or asset instruments into scope? So those all need to be done. Then we need to make our case, our recommendation for our management. We also need to work with the corporate sustainability side as well, because they will have targets that are impacted by this. And then it's a huge internal effort of communicating, aligning before we get the approvals and then we go public.
Understand. Here comes my final question, because so when you are actually launching so many initiatives, right? I mean, in the meantime, you also need to be aware of what are the new innovations or changes in the markets, right? Talking about ESG investments, are you aware of any particular new innovations which are coming along in the industry, such as, besides green bonds, maybe AI as well? I believe AI must have a place to play in the ESG investment as well.
AI does have a place, but before we get there, you mentioned any innovations. I would say certain innovations that come to my mind are sustainability linked bonds, blue bonds, and transition bonds.
Right.
Some of the challenges with that is, depending on who calls it a transition, there's no one global classification or context. There's lots of different regional classifications and taxonomies, and if those products aren't tied to either industry or widely enough recognized indicators or frameworks, then it's a danger that what you call a transition bond, I call something else, and then that could be greenwashing too. Right. So those are newer instruments that we've seen. We're tracking this space before we developments in this space before we take any actions in them. We don't rule anything out. We don't rule anything in, but we want a certain degree of maturity and enough market participants investing in those instruments before we look at it with a view for us to invest in those. AI, you mentioned. AI, of course, will have a role to play as well. What we can think of straight away on ESG investing space is AI can, for example, be used, if I'm just thinking off the top of my head for a use case, if our analyst is looking at 10 companies' sustainability or ESG reports, and each one is between 100 and 300 pages.
Oh yeah, this is where AI can help.
Instead of the poor analyst or analysts like looking through that, which in an ordinary world they should be looking through all that. AI can help summarize those what are the salient features, but then you also, that doesn't mean that the analyst can't just sit there and just take the outputs from the AI. They need to do a health check that the AI is not misinterpreting or worse, hallucinating or on the summarized effects of those external disclosures. So that's a great case that we can think of. And then maybe as the models develop, then there may be cases for, in terms of data analytics and using AI to certainly predict certain either paths or outcomes. So we certainly do see an increasing potential for AI to be used in sustainable investment for sure. Yes, we're definitely watching that space.
Duncan, you also just mentioned about in terms of the investment products. I believe there must be a lot of occasions that you need to work closely with your fund managers, product providers.
We aren't really pushing out ESG funds, and ESG funds have taken a bit of a battering, both in terms of a couple of years ago there was a reclassification wave where certain funds in Europe were reclassified from 9 to 8 and from 8 to 6, and also the product demands here in Asia. The investors, the retail investors, they want good returns, what they call good returns, and certainly you can see that some of the funds, a lot of them will have excluded certain types of investments, whereas if you go and buy oil, for example, with the Ukraine war, then those stocks and securities have been performing well. So the demand for ESG funds has been relatively mixed, but we do work with our fund managers when we give them outsourced mandates, because then we get the chance to shape the parameters of those mandates and the investment objectives and any kind of criteria and requirements that we have. So we do have that way of working with our fund managers.
Perfect. I mean, Duncan, so we have been discussing about 25 minutes. ESG and ESG investment is a big topic.
Yeah.
And I would also think it is also a new baby, born probably a few years ago, right? And still have a long way to go and so many assignments to be expected in the near future.
Definitely. It's going to be an interesting one going forward. The noises coming from and the winds coming from the US make it interesting, but there should be a future. And we also take the view that at least insofar as our company is concerned, there is no difference between investing and sustainable investing. It should be one and the same.
Exactly. I think eventually it got to be driven by purpose.
Yes.
As you just said, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Duncan.
Thank you.
So I hope that our audience today will record this episode or save this episode. I mean, look, these are all the valuable insights from industry experts, from Duncan. I hope through this episode you understand more about Duncan, understand more about perhaps AI as well. I mean, the leader in insurance company. So we will see you in our next episode.
Great. Thanks
Okay,
very
thank
much.
you.
Enjoyed it. Take care. Bye-bye.